Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the fascinating history, sociology, and hard data behind how humanity's absolute oldest institution is fundamentally transforming right before our eyes. We're going to look at exactly where we came from, where we are right now, and where the family unit is heading.
I want to kick things off by asking a question that completely challenges a massive modern misconception. Was the traditional marriage actually built on romantic love? We tend to look back with a lot of nostalgia, just assuming that people in the past married mostly for affection and intimacy. But honestly, the historical record tells a completely different and frankly way more pragmatic story.
To answer that, we'll hit 6 key areas today. First, the shift from alliances to romantic love. Second, the modern marriage shift. Third, decoupling marriage and parenthood. Fourth, how we actually measure divorce. Fifth, global trends and divides. And finally, the future of family. All right, Section 1, from alliances to romantic love. Let's get right into the historical baseline and dismantle that myth of the traditional 1950s marriage. If we look all the way back to 2350 BCE in ancient Mesopotamia, marriage was basically just an economic contract for property and alliances. Your kids, they were quite literally your primary workforce. It's wild to think about, but for most of human history, marrying for love was actually viewed as a really dangerous and socially disruptive idea. Moving into the 1800s, it wasn't until the Victorian era that we started seeing a shift toward romantic sentimentality, combined with this idea of separate spheres for men and women. Then came the post-WW2 1950s. We often think of this as the baseline, but it was really a massive historical anomaly, totally fueled by an economic boom that allowed for a single male breadwinner. And as we're going to see, that so-called perfected traditional model simply couldn't last. Moving right along to Section 2, the modern marriage shift. Let's look at the massive economic changes that flipped the script.
Think about the journey from the factory floor of the Industrial Revolution straight to the modern pursuit of emotional fulfillment. Before the Industrial Revolution, young adults were totally structurally dependent on inheriting family land. But wage labor changed absolutely everything. Suddenly, you can move to the city and actually survive on your own. When you combine women entering the workforce en masse with the widespread availability of modern contraceptives, boom, the game changed completely. People no longer had to marry just for financial survival or because of an unexpected pregnancy. For the first time, marriage transitioned from a mandatory economic alliance into a voluntary choice based entirely on emotional fulfillment.
Now, check out the precipitous drop in the OECD data. The decline is absolutely staggering. Back in 1970, most of these countries had crude marriage rates between 7 and 10 per 1,000 people. By 2022, many have dropped to half of that, sometimes even less. The US, which historically had really high marriage rates, has literally hit its lowest point in recorded history. And it's not just that marriage rates are dropping. Those who do decide to tie the knot are waiting way longer. The mean age at first marriage absolutely skyrocketed by 2021 compared to 1990, especially in Nordic and Mediterranean countries. Look at Iceland, Sweden, and Spain. The average age for women getting married is nearing 35, and for men, it's pushing 37. What we're really seeing here is the explosive rise of cohabitation as a long-term alternative to formal marriage. People are spending their 20s living together, building their careers, and only considering marriage much later in life, if they even consider it at all. Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, decoupling marriage and parenthood. Let's look at how cohabitation is reshaping the way we raise kids. This is such a stark contrast. In the past, single parenting was tragically driven by mortality. If you were a single parent centuries ago, it was usually because your spouse had died, and you almost certainly remarried as fast as possible out of necessity. But today's landscape, it's completely defined by the deliberate decoupling of marriage and parenthood. In a lot of OECD countries, over a third of kids are born to unmarried parents. This is largely driven by couples choosing to cohabitate and have kids entirely outside the legal bounds of marriage, or, through modern relationship breakdowns that don't result in immediate remarriage. But this modern shift does bring a pretty harsh reality check. See that 47%? As Eurostat data reveals, 47% of single-parent households in European countries are currently at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Even as our society becomes super accepting of diverse family structures, the actual financial architecture of our world still heavily penalizes single parents. It's a huge gap between our evolving social norms and our rigid economic realities. All right, Section 4, how we measure divorce. Time to look at the real data versus the urban myths.
We've all heard the myth, right? Exactly half of all marriages end in divorce. Well, to see why that's super misleading, we need to look at how researchers use the refined divorce rate. This metric actually accounts for the shrinking number of people tying the knot today. If you just look at the total number of divorces per 1,000 people, the crude rate, you're mixing in a massive population of people who aren't even married in the first place. By focusing specifically on the population of married women ages 15 and older, we get a way truer picture. And the truth? The refined divorce rate in the US actually peaked around 1980 and has been steadily falling ever since.
And to get an even clearer picture, top researchers don't just look at yearly totals. They use what's called birth cohort tracking. Basically, if you got married in the 1970s, you were part of a generation going through a massive cultural earthquake regarding gender roles, which obviously led to really high divorce rates. But today, tracking specific marriage years reveals that newer marriages are heavily concentrated among highly educated adults, and statistically, they're much more stable. Marriage has kind of evolved into a capstone achievement for people who wait until they've secured their financial footing.
So, Section 5, Global Trends and Divides. Let's see how these stats play out across different regions.
The contrast between the two regions we're looking at here is incredibly revealing. While the U.S. stabilized under that capstone model after peaking around 1980, take a look at South Korea. They hit their divorce peak in the early 2000s and are currently experiencing a severe demographic crisis. Women there have rapidly gained high levels of education and economic independence, but the cultural expectations around marriage are still deeply traditional, basically demanding that women shoulder massive burdens of housework, childcare, and elder care. Faced with this huge mismatch in the marriage market, a lot of women are simply saying no thanks and opting out of marriage entirely.
Which leads us to our final section, Section 6, the future of family. Let's talk about what's coming next.
We are seeing the rapid rise of some truly fascinating alternatives that are challenging standard family law for the next decade. For instance, you have deeply committed couples who actively choose to live in separate houses just to maintain their autonomy. This is called living apart together, and it makes up 10% of adults in Britain right now. You're also seeing the growing prevalence of consensual non-monogamy. And these aren't just fringe movements anymore. Polyamory is literally emerging as a new political constituency, and it's requiring totally new legal frameworks to handle everyday things like hospital visitation, inheritance, and child custody.
A legal expert from Emory University makes a really provocative point here. Family law must evolve to legally support these new structures, or formal marriage will just continue its massive decline. And this matters to all of us. Because if the law doesn't catch up to how people are actually choosing to live, love, and raise kids today, the traditional legal contract of marriage, which is built around that 1950s anomaly we talked about, will just become increasingly irrelevant.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on as we wrap up our explainer. Since the data definitively shows that the 1950s nuclear family is no longer the default, how do you define family in the modern world? We've seen today that this institution has never been stagnant. It has always adapted to the economic and social realities of its time. We went from property alliances to romantic soulmates, and now we're moving into a diverse spectrum of deeply personal arrangements. The family isn't dying, folks. It's just evolving into its next chapter. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, and as always, keep questioning the data.